right. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you happen to be. Thanks for joining us today and welcome to our webinar on Power BI, more than just visuals, how to analyze and understand your data. My name is Nick Seamus, a Customer Success Director with NetWoven. Today we'll be learning more about Power BI and its ability to help you understand and visualize your data in new and striking ways. We'll be presenting an overview of Power BI and its unique value as part of your data estate. We'll be sharing some best practices and discussing the Microsoft Data Observability Framework before showing several real-world examples and scenarios in Power BI. We'll finish up with the Q&A session, including our panel of subject matter experts in data analytics. And please, today's event is designed to be an interactive experience. So please share any specific data challenges you're experiencing or anticipate. No need to hold your questions to the end. Please submit them in the Q&A portion of the presentation, and we'll do our best to answer them. Our presenter today from the NetWoven Analytics team is Joe Fioretti, Principal Business Intelligence Consultant. Joe will also participate in the Q&A panel after the presentation, and we'll be joined by some of our guests from Microsoft, Chris Chalmers and Jeff Fawcett, for some additional perspective on Power BI. Quick background on NetWoven for those of you new to us. We're a preferred Microsoft solutions partner. We've been helping organizations across the globe achieve value from their Microsoft portfolio for the past 22 years. In addition to our data and analytics work, many of our customers have shared that our broad experience across Dynamics 365, Microsoft 365, and Azure has been critical to their digital transformations. A bit more about today's presentation. It's designed to be an interactive experience again, so please submit your questions via the Q&A interface as you see here at any time, and we'll open up for a more general discussion during the Q&A session. In the panel segment, we'd love to hear more about some of your specific data challenges again, so please don't be shy. We'll also be sharing a few polls to help us shape the discussion. We appreciate you helping with those. And after this poll, I'd like to turn it over to our presenter today, Joe Fioretti.
Joe, we need you to come off mute, please.
That would make a huge difference. Thank you. So I see everyone got a poll as soon as they joined for how comfortable are you currently with Power BI? And it looks like, at least from my side, I don't know if everyone else can see the results, but what I'm seeing is basically a third is not at all, they don't have any experience, and another third is comfortable looking to advance. So I think that's a great mix to have in this webinar, because some of the details here are intro level, focus on what is Power BI, and then also make sure you get a good framework and ground set up for you to be able to take advantage of Power BI moving forward. So with that, I'm going to jump right in. First one is, what is Power BI? I think, like I mentioned, there's some people that are just beginning, and then there's probably some people in here that may even know more than everybody else on this call, advanced level reporting and integrations, and that we might be able to learn something from. But I always feel like it's important to make sure we at least cover the basics just enough so we're all speaking the same thing. Because when you say Power BI, it's an all-encompassing ecosystem of Power BI Desktop, where we can create the reports, Power BI Service, where we can see and access the reports that either we made or other people made. And then there's the Power BI mobile apps available on smartphones for mobile formatted reports. Separate to that, there's also Power BI Report Builder, which is kind of Power BI's version of SSRS reports. So you can move those reports from on-premise into Power BI, as well as the Power BI Report Server, which is an on-premise version of Power BI Service if you require that additional layer of security. So when we say Power BI, we're really talking about more or less all three of these main ones at the top. Mostly just Power BI Desktop and Power BI Service are used interchangeably, with a lot of the features in Power BI Desktop now available actually in Power BI Service to modify and update reports. So with that, the important thing is, how does Power BI match your role? Especially for the people that don't have much experience in Power BI, knowing that there's several different components to this. How does Power BI match what you're trying to do in your business? So if you're a business user, typically you'll be focused on Power BI service, where you view the reports and you view the dashboards, maybe you receive email alerts for reports that other people created. Sometimes business users may also be using Power BI Desktop if they're more of a power user, or if the organization is set up to have published data sets where those business users can go in and start to create their own ad hoc reporting. But more or less, they're the end users for the reports that other people are creating. Next up would be the report creators. If, say, you're part of your business intelligence team, or business intelligence engineer, typically you'll use Power BI Desktop to create the reports and then publish them into Power BI service for others. Also depends on how things are structured. You might also be the one managing Power BI service, because there's a number of administrative components to providing access to the reports, refreshing the data, and overall governance of your Power BI environment. And then lastly, kind of a branch off of the report creators would be developers. And these are people that are going to use a lot of more of the advanced functions with the Power BI API, where you can automate a lot of processes for refreshing, for notifications, and for updating and deleting reports as needed, as well as embedding your dashboards into other things such as Dynamics 365 or other custom applications. And lastly, even going so far as to create completely new visualizations, maybe enhancements to the existing ones with some more specific branding to your organization, or completely new ideas that you can create and then publish into the marketplace. So with all that, why is Power BI important? Well, Power BI is part of Microsoft's Power Platform. It's the visualization component to Power Platform, along with Power Apps and Power App Flows. The main components to it are, democratizes your data. It allows everyone in your business to have access to the data without needing IT to create every single possible report and query. If things are structured well from the ground up, for example, the IT department or business intelligence department can create published data sets that are already curated, calculations are already done. You can have a single source of truth that the organization can have access to, and then the users can go in and create some of their own ad hoc reporting without having to wait for IT to develop everything for them. Next is seamless compatibility. As it's pretty obvious through the way Microsoft tries to function everything here, and it integrates with all the other tools they have. This integrates fluidly with Office 365 and Dynamics 365. You can embed reports directly into PowerPoint. You can embed dashboard links into Teams, making it a lot easier to collaborate and share among the different teams in your organization without having more IT overhead to share and gain access and permissions to each report. Next would be innovation and adaptability. As the reports are created, you start to, at first you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what data you have, you don't know what reports you want. And slowly you go a little further, and now you have a little more insight into what data you have. As one report gets created, you understand or see that there's different data sets available that you didn't know the organization even had or tracked. And now the requirements have changed, and you can start looking at things in a different way and start to adapt and update them. I always like to look at this as the if you give a mouse a cookie model, where organizations don't know what reports they want. And as we start to get into some of the more basic ones, the requirements start to get a little more tricky and a little more exciting when they start to their eyes open and they see all the different kind of options that they have now that they know what data they're collecting. And all of this obviously leads into a competitive advantage for that business. You understand different components to your market that you couldn't have seen earlier, and you're able to implement and change things faster. And then lastly, being part of the Microsoft Power Platform means that the other components can also utilize Power BI. For example, you can query a Power BI data set from a Power App flow. You can create actions based on that data and feed everything in a full circle situation between every different component. So with that, I want to talk about the key best practices for using Power BI effectively. And this is Power BI, but it's more of just a business intelligence data analysis at a high level. Those three main components that here at NetWoven, we boil them down to our data, design, and support. And we try to function under these pillars anytime we're helping support any kind of business intelligence engagement. But the first one, and obviously the most important, being the data. Of all three components, without the data, nothing else really exists. And all three of these components all work together in harmony. You can't, if any one of these components is broken or missing, the whole system's not going to work. So the data, garbage in, garbage out. It doesn't matter how good your design is. It doesn't matter how well your calculations are. If the underlying data is wrong, or if those calculations are wrong, or you're missing key parts of that data, the rest of it's useless. You can have the prettiest award-winning design out there, but it doesn't matter if it's not answering the right questions. Which goes on to the second one: know what you're trying to answer. It doesn't do anybody any good if they're not telling the right story, if you're designing for something different than what they're expecting. So it's important to make sure you define those objectives for that report or dashboard early on and keep asking those clarifying questions. Often the business users that are requesting that report, they don't know how the underlying data is structured. They don't know what data even exists outside of what they see on their front end version of the application or system. So sometimes this means you might need to sit with them or do a screen share or something to see what they're looking at and see how the data translates on the back end. And make sure that as you go through the process that you find ideally some specific examples that they could help work with you so you can match up on your end what you're seeing matches up with what they're seeing. And then lastly, the data model that you use, that you either in your underlying data or that you're bringing into Power BI itself, needs to be well thought out and well structured. That means the right relationships, the right relationship types, custom columns and new measures into Power BI. You need to make sure that what you're doing is thoughtful and well planned out so that you don't have 6 different fields that all are called sum underscore. And then when the business gets into it, they don't know which is the right one, especially if they're going to start using your published data set. Or ultimately for your own self, when you need to go back and troubleshoot something and you have nonsense names for the fields you've created, ultimately ends up giving yourself more overhead and makes it tricky to troubleshoot and manage the system going further. Ultimately, the goal is to have an overarching data set that can be used through multiple reports. And the only way that's going to work is if it's designed well and efficiently from the beginning, which might mean taking a little extra time to think ahead to what other fields and what other calculations need to be created so that this can scale effectively and have good performance. The next one is design. I took some examples here for choose the right visual. This is obviously not the right visual. And smart filter and slicer design. Design is the next component because it doesn't matter if you have the world's most perfect query and data model and the greatest DAX calculations ever. If no one can understand the story that you're trying to tell, it doesn't matter. As far as the visual type, choose the right visual. Like I said, not all visuals are created equal. Choosing the right visual type is critical in getting your message across, and often in that case, less is more. For example, this painful pie chart has the same colors repeated 100 times. You can't see the text. And unfortunately, this is a real example that I took from a real report. So you don't need to fill every single pixel of the screen with information. Make sure you're just you're presenting a message that can be understood with just a few seconds and just as little context as possible. Now, for example, if you're using a specific color somewhere, you have a dark blue on your legend somewhere for a bar chart or a line chart, be consistent. Make sure that same color doesn't mean something else later on in the report on a different page or somewhere else on the same page, because people aren't going to have as much exposure to how this works as you are, and they may have a different understanding of what they think that means. And then the slicers and filters, it's important to use them carefully. You don't need to have a slicer for every single field in your data set or even every single field that's on the page. For example, this is yet another example that I took, not a real example, but it's as close to real as I can. But I've seen this and worse, where every single thing is just thrown on there as a slicer with no regard to style or design or which ones are even going to get used by the business. Not to mention combining slicers with filters and trying to make sure people understand how they function differently. It's just going to lead to trouble and ultimately poor adoption of the report. Ultimately, if you need to have a significant number of slicers to be able to filter down your data, it might be helpful to instead have a slicer page where it's a configuration page on the report where everything is synced throughout, and people can go to that one page to make all the updates they need to then go back and look at the data, ultimately freeing up a whole lot more screen real estate than trying to make something like this work over here. And then the last one for the 3 best practices is support. So number one is that user training and documentation. It's easy to forget that while you may have spent hours, possibly days, developing this report and underlying queries and know every single component of this data, every join, every table that's connected here, your users won't. No matter how devoted and how much you love the report you created, likely it's something they need to consume with as little time as possible and devote as little time to training and learning how it functions. They need to be able to get in, see what you've built, understand the story it's trying to tell, and get out. So any kind of training you can use to guide them, whether it's actual one-on-one or group training to show how the report functions, or maybe some separate documentation, will go a long way of being able to onboard new people as the reports get shared out. And this doesn't always need to be external documentation or training meetings. It could even just be different text blocks that you put onto the report or arrows to guide where people need to look so that it can catch their focus first and understand how this report functions. Next is keeping the data fresh. A major issue is you may have set your Power BI report to refresh at a certain time without regarding where in the entire pipeline does that data sit. So that means keeping your data fresh all the way back to the source. And so this may mean having to work with other engineers on the team if they're managing that ETL process, but it's critical to really make sure that if there's multiple steps to get the data out of that source system and into Power BI, everything needs to be refreshed at the right time and in the right process. And this is where some of the advanced functions come into play with some of the Power BI API. You could have an Overwatch system that manages all the different refresh stop processes and then triggers the next one only when the previous one is done, rather than just hoping and trusting that this time it will take exactly as long as it's supposed to take every time, which is often an issue for support going on where report users get in the morning and the report doesn't have today's information or yesterday's information. And you need to go in and you see, while every other day the previous step finished at 7:30, today it finished at 7:45, and it has a cascading effect going down. And then lastly is access and security. In my experience, the best way to stunt any Power BI adoption is to make sure that your users have to jump through as many hurdles as possible to get to the reports. So this is usually best solved by having different workspaces, granting access at the security group levels, not individual users, and making sure that there's a process in place so that when things are published, people have access. People that should have access already have the access they need, and this trails down into the underlying system. So if you embed a report into a portal or into Dynamics, making sure that everything is set up so that first time that you deploy it and every time that new users try to access it, they have all the access to see the reports and either download or share or collaborate as they need without having to go through support tickets and IT to try to get help. Because ultimately, if they have major headaches trying to get to the information, it's going to slow down the adoption and how many people try to access it. Then going back one step to that topic of data freshness, Nick touched on this earlier. We want to talk about the data observability framework, a process we put in place here at NetWoven on any of our engagements where we are working on business intelligence to make sure that everybody can see into their data and they know where it is and they know what it is and how much it is. So those main 5 pillars of the data observability framework. First is freshness. Is your data current? Users need to know if the data and the calculations they're seeing is the most current and the most accurate. And the last thing we want is for the business to make some important decisions without realizing that they're using incomplete data. This can be as simple as on a report page, you can put somewhere, in the bottom corner, what is the most recent, sales date or transaction date in the data set. And this will cue in to people see, oh, it hasn't been updated in 2 days. It needs to get fixed, or it's as current as it can possibly get. So we're good to go. Next is distribution. Is it clean? Is it within acceptable ranges? There may be, depending on what kind of data we're looking at, outliers may be acceptable. You may have a once a year huge transaction that falls well outside, the standard deviation. But it's important to know that somebody has seen that, somebody knows that it's outside that range, but it's still acceptable and we can move forward with it. Because the last thing you need is to have some part of your data translation step, move a decimal or some other issue that ends up changing what those ranges are and have a cascading effect downward with reporting. So next is volume. For example, if your data suddenly goes from 200 million rows to 20 million, you should know before the users do. And similarly, you could have on that page, like we had the most recent date, you could have the total number of transactions. And people that have enough awareness of the business may realize and see that, normally we're at a certain number and this seems to be missing a substantial amount. And this allows, you can see that there's a problem before the users do. For example, if you don't have any of those metrics that you see that you have less transactions than you should have, and depending on how the final report is designed that your users are accessing, they might not realize that they're only seeing 10% of the data. Now, for example, if the only thing on the report are, moving averages and percentages, there's no way to see raw total transactions to know that there's an issue. Next is the schema. Changes in the underlying schema can either cause catastrophic failures in that data pipeline, resulting in either data being lost, corrupted, or just failing and not being updated. Or, in my opinion, a worse example would be where it just silently succeeds even though the data has changed. An example I've seen real world use was where in the source system, everything that was decimals part of the way through the process got converted to integers, and then a later step converted everything back to decimals. And this resulted in all the numbers being rounded off. And on a smaller scale, maybe it's not that noticeable and not that impactful, but at a larger enterprise level, had a significant change on what the business was seeing, especially considering that change only occurred on one side of their transaction system, resulting in a lot of numbers being well off of what they expected them to be. So then lastly is the lineage. We need to know where in the pipeline did it break? What happened? This ties all the different pillars together so we know what went wrong, where it went wrong, and what data is still clean and safe. Can we resolve the issue and move forward? And then so ultimately this allows the whole business, you put all these pillars together and the business can be confident in knowing that what they're seeing is all of their data and they can make well-informed decisions, as well as the team maintaining the data set can have, for example, a data observability dashboard or command center or whatever you want to call it, where they can see before the business does if there's any issues. They receive alerts on it and they can make changes or at least make people notified that there's an issue and we're aware of it and we're working on it. So with that, we're going to turn over to
Joe,
just
quick question there. So that's a lot of
Yeah.
good information about the data observability. So aren't there some challenges as well with increased data observability and just in terms of things like storage and logging and issues around there? Is that something that you may be able to touch on?
Yeah, so obviously the more logging you do, the more storage it takes up. A lot of it depends on how it's implemented, and I think it's usually done best by just monitoring what data is in the underlying entities and tables, and then maybe having a few different metadata fields and tables to say, after review, this is what the normal acceptable range is, so we could always reference this. Typically, most ETL jobs and processes are already doing some logging. Azure Data Factory has logging built in. It has alerts that can be set based on any different number of fields and parameters in it. So there isn't all that much overhead. It's just a matter of making sure that the observability framework you put in is dynamic and scalable so that it's easy to update when you bring in yet another new table or data source. It's automatically going to be monitoring that one as well.
Great.
So,
So please share any other questions about what we've discussed so far. We do have another question for you, Joe, back to the visualization slide.
Okay.
If you wouldn't mind cycling back a bit. Is there a methodical way to figure out how to choose the right visual?
Yeah, so there's a number of resources online, and we can send some of those links for, how your data is structured, what is kind of the best practice visual to choose. But in general, one of the examples I'm actually going to show kind of follows what I try to do as best practices in far as report design, where, the top, you want to start, whatever's in the top left is that 3-second CEO number that he wants to look at and move on. And as you go further down the page, gets more and more detailed all the way until you get to, the cross tab that the data analysts want to see and download into Excel. So Chris, I think I saw you had your hand up if you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, if we're finished with the visuals, it was back on the data observability framework.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the observation because here at Microsoft, there's really intense interest in AI and co-pilots and our future investments in this area. And our AI is not smarter than your data. And I just wanted to echo the importance of your data observability framework, because like if your column name for sales is DF underscore sales 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the AI
Yep.
cannot figure that out. So, as we look forward to this AI enhanced future, this is still a very important step, if not the most important step, is that your end users can understand and interpret your data. And this data observability framework is the best thing I've seen going in terms of preparation for that step. So I just wanted to observe that. Thanks.
Thank you. So real quick, I got 2 demos I want to show you. Make sure we save as much time as possible for the Q&A. Those 2 are, we have a financial margin analysis demo, and this is actually part of a ready to deliver package that we have that we've delivered for other clients, as some self-service components as well for ad hoc reporting. And it kind of follows that simple design approach I talked about on the design component and that I just touched on with Nick. And then next we have the retail dream demo. This is more of a sophisticated full industry example, as more advanced visualizations, some custom visuals, as well as navigation between dashboards and embedded reports, as well as demonstrating some of the new little Q&A components in new visuals in Power BI. I'll get over to that real quick. First we have talk about that margin analysis report. So this is that what I try to follow with best practices. You have just a very few amount of slicers up top here. I actually totally hide the filter pane because I've learned it just confuses people. And that way, we start on the top left, we have just those KPI numbers. You can even modify these so that they change colors based on certain dynamic rules. But ultimately, that top left is just whatever is the main point of this report, boiled down to, in this case, 4 different numbers. From there, we drill down a little further into the different components for cross time. And as you can select on different things, sorry, it's moving a little slow today. Yep, so as you select different bars in here, it automatically refilters on everything else in the page. We can see then here we have that cross tab that, that data analyst is going to want to download into Excel, share out as they need to. And then lastly, in the bottom right is our matrix with some dynamic coloring based on, where is our gross profit based on any given customer. And so here we can see anything that's below 0, we want to automatically turn red. So not the most amazing, striking. Microsoft's probably not going to use this in their, splash page for Power BI because it's not too crazy visual, but this I feel follows a good less is more answer to trying to design your reports to answer some simple questions and then have a different report that answers other ones. And so, like I said, this is also part of that solution package we have that this says ad hoc reporting. So when you have other costs, such as warehousing, transaction costs, shipping costs, there's different components where you can put those numbers in and regenerate on the fly what that margin price is, so you can see and do some ad hoc testing with various customers. So that's also something that later on, if there's any interest, we can have a conversation, talk with Nick, and show some more specific examples of how that works. Next is that retail dream demo. This is where there's for the CEO of a larger retail organization, for campaign analytics, social media, location analytics. This is actually a Power BI dashboard, which has different visuals from several different Power BI reports all embedded into it. So we can click into any one of these, say we click into tweets, and this actually takes us down into a totally different Power BI report that has its own separate filters into different components in here. And then you could just always go back, then go into a different area on that same dashboard. And then lastly is, it's a different one here for that same retail dream demo, but this is our predictive analytics. This is has more AI functions to it. So one I always like to show off in here is the open Q&A. So while this page here is all different visuals that a person, developer, whoever, sat down and made each of these, sized them, put the labels in, chose the colors, and put everything in. The next one, instead, you could go to the Q&A visual, which is out of the box with Power BI, but nobody physically sat down and created all the different options on here. So we could say, show me customer experience by factors by city on a tree map. And it creates all those different fields based on the underlying data and puts it into this visual here. This wasn't something that a person sat down and made sure that, okay, well, someone's going to ask this specific question, so I need to make this specific visual. Because ultimately, I can just come here and ask for a matrix instead. And it automatically regenerates the same thing, but as a matrix. So we can drill down further into that data for all those different factors. We'll go back one step here. There's say customer experience by factor in a bar chart. The same thing. This gets dynamically generated just based on your language up here. And if you start typing something wrong, so say instead of a matrix, I said in a crosstab, which is more of a financial term. Well, it doesn't know what that means. But I can ask the person that developed this that I need to have crosstab defined because that's how our business communicates. And they'll receive a notification on that, and they can go in and they can, in the semantics for the report, identify crosstab and make it mean matrix. So when the rest of the business comes in, they don't all need to relearn something. They can still communicate as they normally do. So for example, like we had, in a bar chart, and then we could get even more fancy. We could do in a bar chart with, city small multiples, something that there's no way anyone sat down to develop all these different components. And you can get very fancy and detailed with this dynamic reporting, which is once you do a little bit of end user training, people can start to come in here, and rather than have to open up Power BI desktop and play around and understand how it functions, give them just a little bit of training in the different nuances of this QA pane and the different language they need to use, and they could start to do a lot of their own things, make it really interesting insights that they wouldn't even have thought to ask initially. From there, they could send you what their question was in a screenshot, and you could then develop a full report around what they're asking for it. So no, that was really fast. Had a lot of information I wanted to try to get through in as quick time as possible. I want to make sure we save some time for our Q&A. So welcome our Q&A panel, Chris and Jeff, onto the screen here. Love to see. I haven't been watching the chat, but hopefully some questions have come in.
Yeah, and Chris and Jeff, would you mind doing a quick introduction of yourselves?
Thanks, I'd be happy to. My name is Chris Chalmers, and I am part of the Microsoft Field Organization, and I talk about Power BI with the largest customers in our retail vertical. And I'm joined by Jeff Fawcett. Jeff?
Yeah, hello everyone. So Jeff Fawcett, I live in the Seattle area. I do exactly what Chris just described as our role, but I'm focused on customers that do software and digital platform. Uh, so things like Meta and Uber and eBay and people like that. So that's my customer set. But Chris and I have the same role. I'm looking forward to chatting with you guys today. So I haven't seen a question yet, Joseph, but I did have a comment I can throw out
Okay.
if it's a place to start.
Yeah.
So I was noticing with the Q&A visual, and I just happened to have a couple of conversations with customers about that recently, because I think in our current suite we have a number of AI visuals. The Q&A one is the natural language query one. So it's the closest to kind of the current cycle of what's going on with ChatGPT and natural language type. It's based on a prior technology. It is going to, be upgraded as more of the open AI stuff comes into Power BI. But one of the key points is that Chris made earlier is the data. To make that really work well, the data needs to be tight, meaning really well-defined column names. What I've observed too is not too many as well. So if you're building a data model, Q&A works best where there's maybe a couple of metrics related to each other, a couple of categorical dimensions, time, geography, things like that. If you start getting into 20 dimensions and 50 measures, and it wrestles with that, just as the human mind does, right? When you're thrown that much dimensionality and that many metrics, it's challenging for the human brain to kind of figure out what is the meaning in here. So I just wanted to reiterate Chris's point that well-defined and kind of smaller focused data sets that answer questions within a general domain, Q&A can do that pretty well. And I'm going to drop a thing into the chat that is a great place to start if in our documentation, if that's of interest to you. There's also some great videos online about Q&A has a built-in capability to add synonyms. And if you're a model builder using Q&A, there's a way to review the questions that are coming in from your users that are hitting the model, and you can see which ones it's not parsing well, which ones it's bonky, because people are using different words to mean different things, and you can go in and kind of tune the model to answer more efficiently the kind of questions that are being asked. So it's got kind of a cool built-in capability to do that. There's a couple of good videos online about how to do that. It's all built into the tool, so you don't even have to go out and modify files and stuff. It's all kind of baked right in there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
thanks.
And Jeff, if I could just add to that, I really believe less is more. I think when people start with Power BI, they have the tendency to include fields just in case. Call it the kitchen sink effect. I don't know what my I don't know what my report developers, they may need this field. And not only is the presence of all these fields confusing for report developers, it's also confusing for the AI, to Jeff's earlier point. I mean, you look in our CRM system, our opportunity object, it has 100 columns, so less is more. And Joe, I really loved your report that you showed earlier. You're kind of self-deprecating in terms of the complexity of it. It's easy to understand. A good report asks a question and the answer was right there. Like, this is the margin percentage, this is the margin number, and it wasn't filled with every possible attribute of margin. So I really like that. And again, it's not just for human interpretability, it's for the Q&A interpretability as well.
Thank you. We got
Right.
some questions come in. Nick, you got those?
Yeah, so panel, we have a cluster of questions that seem to be around governance in Power BI. So what's your top 5 list for things to watch out for in Power BI governance?
I'll give my top two off the top of my head, and hopefully that'll buy Jeff enough time to come up with the next three. The first one is getting clear on the separation between a data model and a report, because when you start with Power BI and you publish your first report, you've actually got two artifacts. You've got the data set or the data model, and you've got the report. And in a well-managed organization, these are two separate things. Ostensibly, they use two separate skill sets. And you don't see it at first because you're like, hey, I published my first report. But I'd say one really important thing is having the data models really tight. And there are some serious business reasons for that. For instance, how we calculate gross margin. I don't have a finance background. What if Jeff and I both create data sets and we create gross margin differently, or we calculate it differently, right? So, that could have terrifying consequences, especially if you're a publicly traded company and you attested to those metrics. So, first big one is separation of data model and report, and implied with that is having the rigor around your calculations, so your data model's trustworthy. And Joe, you touched on this earlier in the data observability framework in terms of oversight and accountability for all that sort of thing. Jeff, the next place I was going to go was workspace governance, and I'll be brief. We have documented guidance in terms of how many workspaces, how to name them, how to manage them. Because again, you get your license, it's woohoo. I'm not getting charged for workspaces, right? Power BI is per user charge. It's not per workspace. I'm going to make 100 of them, and Jeff's going to make his 100. That is hell to clean up. So, from the beginning, having a good workspace governance plan, something that makes sense to you. Maybe it's naming conventions. I'm sure NetWoven's got a lot of IP in this area, but just if you start right, you don't have to clean it up later. And with Power BI apps, you don't even need to let the volume of your end users into the workspace at all. So Jeff, I took two for myself. I'll give you the next three on the top five. How's that?
Yeah, I was going to say the thinking through, and this is where talking with a partner like NetWoven, who's done this many times, especially if you're early in your journey into Power BI, can be very helpful. Thinking through kind of your use case classes. So at the extreme ends would be total self-service, right? Total citizen developed BI. And we're going to give people Power BI Pro licenses, which is kind of the entry level license. We're going to give them the ability to create workspaces. We already have governance of our backend data sources, so they'll have to request that when they want it. But in terms of creating Power BI artifacts, we're going to kind of let them do that and share that at a workspace level with each other. Great. So that's covered. But then at the far end is we need to push some information out there that is official, right? It has the official stamp on it that says when you go to this report and you pull the numbers off of this report, these are the officially kind of corporate numbers. Mm-hmm. And thinking about, okay, how am I gonna set that up? And then what is my flight path going to be if someone develops something that gets popular and is really useful, and I want to kind of pull it in and take it into more corporate management? What's that? And I think thinking through that a little bit and like, okay, how do I set up my Power BI environment so that there's clearly indicated and controlled kind of gated space for IT managed or BI managed assets? And we've got all the tools and knobs and levers to do that. It's just a matter of setting it up so that it works well. I think this is one of the beauties of Power BI is it covers this full spectrum and enables that movement from user generated content to like that needs to be elevated to more corporate level content without having to rewrite it from the ground up. But that would be in terms of governance, that would be the thing I've seen people need to think through. Power BI starts off with the Pro license, which is kind of like everyone's in this kind of shared compute. And then there's premium capacity, which is dedicated compute capacity. Oftentimes that is used as the basis of corporate managed BI assets, because the SLAs for performance can be controlled. It can handle larger data, stuff like that. And if that's the direction you're stepping, I think getting some advice on, okay, how do we set up premium to make sure it's kind of managed the way we want? So that, I don't know if that encompasses three things. I'm going to say it does.
I think that was a great shot, Jeff. So we've got some more questions kind of on the security governance axis. So can multiple users collaborate on a single report at the same time? And can they also collaborate in the same fashion with non-Power BI users?
Well, that last one's an interesting one. Well, so I'll take a crack at this, and then Chris can correct me if needed. So,
are you going to get after it? I couldn't resist. Horrible pun. I couldn't resist.
So that was really bad. It took me a while to process it. So in the kind of citizen dev world, it's think of it kind of a little bit more like working on an Excel spreadsheet together. Right? I'm going to push it up there, and then I'm going to tell my coworker, hey, it's up there, and now you can go work on it and make your tweaks. Excel Online has the ability to modify some stuff at the same time on the same worksheet. Power BI at kind of the basic citizen dev level does not. So it's going to be like a check-in. Okay, I'll go get it and check it out, make my modifications, push it back up there. At the pro developer level, we are releasing a whole bunch of stuff that enables concurrent development and integration into a continuous integration CD pipeline through GitHub. So there's a GitHub integration. I think that's in preview right now, right, Chris? I think the GitHub integration stuff.
It is with Azure repos, and GitHub is coming.
Okay, all right. So this is more what I would consider like BI Pro Dev level type stuff. It's going to be someone who's a bit more comfortable with professional code development type tools, as opposed to a kind of a citizen developer, which would typically be using either Power BI Desktop or maybe editing reports in the web.
Yeah,
All right.
just to make an observation on editing in the web. That dovetails nicely with the Macintosh client support, because we're often asked, hey, where's Power BI Desktop for the Mac? And our strategy is to have feature parity between desktop and browser. So that way, you know, where's the Mac client? Where's the Linux client? Where's the whatever client? It's like, hey, we don't have to worry about it. You can do it all cloud side in the browser. And with the release of the Microsoft Fabric preview, we've made some important advances in browser-based editing capability. So just wanted to sort of put an asterisk next to that observation that it unlocks Macintosh and potentially other scenarios as well.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting we're not at 100% parity yet. Right? There's still a few things that you either need to do in the Power BI Desktop or via code, and typically it has to do with the creation of the underlying model artifact itself. I think of Power BI as kind of three big chunks. There's kind of like an ETL chunk, like go get data and mush that data up, clean it up, get rid of stuff, replace values, all that kind of stuff you do in ETL. Then there's the data model, which is, okay, I brought in this data. How does it relate to each other? What are the lookups? Where do I need to do? What kind of calculations do I want to do on top of this, et cetera? And then there's the visualizations piece. Most of the ETL and the visualizations piece, most are at parity in the web. Not quite all, but pretty close. The model piece, that middle, like build me a data model, that is not quite there. But as Fabric is coming into the world, it's making serious advances on that. So.
Great, thank you. Joe, there's a couple of nested questions here I think we talked about before. So are there tools that can help with data observability, like maybe Microsoft Purview? And can you apply sensitivity labeling to Power BI workspaces? Anyone else?
Joe, sounds like that's a question for
Yeah.
you.
That one I actually don't know if you can or not.
All right, then I'm gonna pitch it to Chris.
Wait, not so fast. So that's a great question.
Yeah.
With Purview, it is possible to identify sensitive columns in your underlying data, et cetera. And once Purview has stamped something as sensitive, Microsoft Information Protection will protect it. And that the reason Jeff and I are stammering a little bit is our data protection isn't necessarily a BI function like, oh, the BI system needs information protection. It's an everywhere thing. So Microsoft Information Protection solves for Power BI, solves for data sources, but it also solves for Microsoft Excel, Word, email spillage, Teams, mobile devices, in browser. I actually probably shouldn't confess this on a recording, but I dragged and dropped something into a personal repository, a personal cloud repository, and it got immediately flagged. I'm like, hey, what's this dialog box? I guess it's actually kind of helpful to prevent these sorts of situations. So it's a long way of saying that Microsoft views the problem holistically. Microsoft's solution encompasses all endpoints and all data types. So specifically to the BI task at hand, yeah, we've got a great answer that encompasses Power BI. If you export to Excel, the protection extends. If you push to mobile client, the protection extends. Specifically about the Purview data source, talking to the BI thing, I'm a little rusty on that, but I'm happy to take that away. Also, I see Yana has his hand up. I don't know if he's going to answer this or not.
Oh, probably need to make him a presenter real quick. There we go. You can probably, now you can unmute yourself now, I think.
Yeah. Hey, this is Jnana. To answer, this data observability, it's my pet subject, absolutely, it's a favorite subject. And, this data creator, it solves most of the problems, which is not solved right now. The product is under development with Fabric, Microsoft Fabric. And, once you add with Purview with the data creator, that almost all, 80 to 90% of, data observability will be sustained, and internally with services. So that's where actually we published a paper, data observability, Microsoft Fabric supports data observability. So that's where, I'm emphasizing again with the data creator and Power Apps, Purview, it almost takes care of data observability. So thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you. We're nearing the end of our time today, so I know we covered a lot of ground, and hopefully you found this engaging. So happy to have any number of follow-up conversations on any of these topics or related topics. But we're often asked, what would be next steps? So we're putting some examples here of common ways we get started talking with organizations about their data estate initiatives. So a little bit more context here. So we often find that organizations have started with Power BI and have not found the success they're looking for, whether it's with governance, performance, or so on, or are struggling to find a way to get their Power BI journey started. So this data analytics and Power BI Jumpstart covers a bunch of issues and topics that you see here, like a strategic roadmap, adoption, change management, governance, security, etc. So many organizations are also working with some more legacy platforms such as Tableau or ClickView or some of these other things. And so they're wondering how they can migrate their existing investment into Power BI. And we commonly do some consulting on that. The third thing you see here is the modern data state assessment, which is a comprehensive view of all aspects of your data estate, from data warehouse to visualizations to user issues, data security, etc. So if you're interested in learning more about any one of those or related topic, please do reach out to us. Next slide, Joe. And this is how you do it. So myself, Nick Seamus, I'm the Customer Success Director here at NetWoven. Here are my contact points. And we have another colleague of ours as well that you're able to reach out to help you with some of those follow-on conversations. And we have one more poll today, if you could help us with that while we have any